The title of this week's Drash, as the inimitable Yogi Berra said, it's like deja vu all over again. Last week our Aliyah was basically a curse followed by a list. Lamech's curse, and then the genealogy of Adam. This week we have another curse, followed by a list. Noach's curse, and then the table of nations. Let's pray. Avinu, our Father, again we would come before you, Father, to look into your word, to understand what we can understand. Ask, Father, that you would illuminate our eyes, that you would grant that we would see what's important, that you would teach us again, that you would have mercy on us to help us. We thank you, Father, for your great goodness towards us. In Yeshua's name, Amen. The question we addressed last week, given the sometimes obscure and difficult language of the early chapters of Genesis, is, what is frosting? That which is fun and interesting, but not really sustenance. And that which is actionable, that which can inform and direct our life and our walk of faith. Last week we found that the curse uttered by Lamech was probably more of like frosting for us. It's curious, it's interesting, but it doesn't really help us in our walk of faith. The generations of Adam, on the other hand, were quite actionable. There were viable lessons for us today in how we understand our place in the work of God and how we act out that faith in faithfulness. I'd like for us to look at the curse uttered by Noach and see if it has lessons for us. And then I'd like to consider the table of nations and ask the same question. So to begin, let's review the circumstances preceding Noach's curse. The flood had just ended. Noach and his family emerged from the ark. In verse 18 it records for us, Genesis 9:18, now the sons of Noach who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. Only 8 folk went into the ark. In the subsequent year, that is during the flood, it seems to offer that the repopulation of the earth has begun. It kind of sounds that way since we've mentioned Canaan. We should also note that the post-flood world was in many ways very different from the antediluvian, the pre-flood world. Aside from the effects of the torrents of water that washed back and forth over the face of the earth for that whole year, several scientists have hypothesized that the fundamental environment changed. Specifically, I refer here to Dr. Carl Baugh of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, right here in Texas, just a little southwest. And he suggests that the antediluvian world had a metallic hydrogen shell around the Earth, which provided a much higher level of UV and cosmic ray protection. There was also a higher atmospheric pressure, perhaps double the current pressure, and a higher CO2 level in the atmosphere. Now, what's really important for our purposes, this environment would make the oxygen levels in the blood much higher. More oxygen in the blood would allow the body to metabolize, that is, digest, alcohol faster. That would make the drinking of wine, the alcohol in it, less of an issue. The body could more easily and quickly metabolize the alcohol, so you wouldn't get intoxicated, easy to say, anywhere near as easily. So Noach could have enjoyed the flavor of the wine in the antediluvian world before the flood without getting drunk. But now, in the post-flood world, the same wine would cause intoxication and Noach would be very surprised by this effect. Rather than Noach being a drunk or escaping into alcohol after the flood, he might actually have been caught off guard by the wine. So we need to be a little careful how we evaluate Noach's conduct. Regardless, the facts are that he was under the influence. He was affected by the wine. So he goes into his tent, and as the alcohol has made him to feel very warm or hot, he disrobes to cool off. Now, the story from here is a bit confusing. So let me list for you the facts that I see. Noach is uncovered in his tent. Ham sees his father's nakedness. Ham tells his brothers. Shem and Japheth turn their eyes away from seeing their father's nakedness. Shem and Japheth cover their father with a garment. Noach wakes up. Noach knows what his youngest son in quotes, did to him. Noach curses Canaan, his grandson, and Noach blesses Shem and Japheth. For me, just for me, there's a huge disconnect here. If Ham was in error, why curse Canaan? Is Noach just a capricious and evil man, cursing an innocent child? If we're right after the flood, is Canaan even there at this time? I mean, maybe he wasn't even born. How can he be cursed? It feels like there are some missing pieces. So let me offer a purely personal speculation that fills in the blanks and for me makes this story flow work. So first assumption, Canaan is listed during the list of the sons who were on the ark. Coming out of the ark, he's listed. He is listed as the son of Ham. My speculation is that Canaan was born either during, probably, or shortly after the flood. They're there for a year. That's plenty of time for a child to be conceived and then born. Second, Canaan was of an accountability age. This is my second assumption. By the time the vineyard could produce grapes. I mean, vineyards don't grow up overnight and wine be produced overnight. So it's entirely possible that Canaan, had gotten to the age that he was accountable. I'm sorry, I skipped a slide there. Canaan was of this accountability age by the time the vineyard could produce grapes, and that the wine was made ready for drinking. So he wasn't just an infant. He was accountable. That's my second assumption. My third assumption is that Canaan was perhaps not well trained. Perhaps he was still a little on the young side, maybe too young to overcome the wildness of youth. Accountable, yes, but not gained enough in the way of maturity. And my fourth assumption, although it's not really that much of an assumption, is that Noach was a righteous man. In Genesis 6:9 it records, "These are the records of the generations of Noach. Noach was a righteous man, blameless in his time, and Noach walked with God." So he's not an evil and capricious man. He's a righteous man. 2 Peter 2:5 kind of picks up this theme where Peter's recording, and he says that God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noach, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. He reiterates that Noach was a righteous man, and being righteous, Noach would not curse an innocent, nor would he act vindictively. Noach would act with completely proper motives. As a righteous man, his life would follow that. So those are my 4 assumptions. And then with these 4 personal assumptions, I'd like to insert those assumptions into the explicit narrative and for me fill in the gaps, or at least the gaps that I see. So first, Noach is uncovered in his tent. My assumption is that Canaan is the one who peers into Noach's tent, sees him naked, and then instead of dealing with it, he spreads a gossip to his father Ham. Ham sees his father's nakedness, and instead of him dealing with it, he spreads a gossip. Ham tells his brothers. Shem and Japheth turn their eyes away so they don't participate in that gossip. Shem and Ham cover their father with a garment so that that perceived or apparent indiscretion was covered over. Noach wakes up. Noach knows what his youngest son did to him. His youngest son could be a grandson. The term son is very broad. It even includes people who are related but not by physical descent, but by perhaps a common employment or a common trade. So the youngest son could be Canaan, and what Canaan did, Noach knows what his youngest son did to him, is that he gossiped, which is universally condemned. Noach then curses Canaan. The curse was directed to Canaan because he was both accountable and the first to sin by seeing and spreading a gossip. Noach blesses Shem and Japheth because they did not listen, they didn't hearken to the gossip, but rather they honored their father by covering him with a garment. But so metaphorically, there's maybe perhaps more to this covering than just the garment. Now, we won't go into this any further at this point because it really isn't part of what I wanted to look at. But there's a whole series of drashim in this about how to properly honor your father, what Shem and Japheth did, especially in regards to what his apparent sin was and covering over it without looking into it. But bottom line for me, is that Canaan and Ham failed in their conduct. And as it seems that Canaan was the first to fail, the curse came to him. Now, remember that there are two primary words for curse. We've talked about this several times. This one, aror, has the sense of being to thwart. It is not the kalal, meaning to treat lightly. So what Noach did for Canaan was to put troubles in his way. The hope of this righteous man, Noach, was that those troubles would bring Canaan to a place of repentance, that he would recognize by those troubles that kept coming up against him, that curse that Noach gave, he would see his error and turn from it. So we ask, is this teaching a meat and potatoes lesson, or is it more a frosting? Curious, but not really life guiding. Now, unfortunately, and if you've not heard of this, you can skip this part of it. Unfortunately, there have been some who have used this curse by Noach against Canaan. Some who have used this to horribly misuse it, this parental discipline, to justify the modern world enslavement of African people. They look at that curse and they say, therefore, suffice it to say that the logic that's used and the hermeneutics that are used to justify this abuse is completely wrong. It doesn't justify any kind of enslavement like this, especially of another people. The passage rather has more to say about the equality of all men, and in no way justifies any enslavement. And actually, rightly understood, there are many important lessons here. We're only mentioning the one about honoring fathers, but there are also lessons on parenting in general. There are lessons about being aware of our environment. Perhaps Noach wasn't. Regardless of how it may be different from what we expect, the world after being different than the world before, we still need to be aware of our environment And I expect there are many more lessons, perhaps hundreds of lessons in this little story. But rightly understood, there are good lessons here for us. So this story of Noach and his curse, there are things here for us. We need to not dismiss it too quickly. But now, I'd like us to focus our thoughts for a bit on this list part. Remember, there's a curse and then a list. In a sense, this list is also a genealogy, but less a direct list of descendants. Rather, it is a derivation of the nations or people groups that make up the totality of humanity. You will note that several of the nations, and I'll use nations in quotes here, listed are grandsons of Noach. Some are great-grandsons. And some are people groups. They're not a person, it's a group of people. And also to note, the list and the interpretation of the nations that come from this list is a little open to debate. Several different people, and even different rabbis and different sages, have come up with a different list of who those nations are. But what is commonly agreed, and this is important, what's commonly agreed is that there are 70, and exactly 70 nations. And as we discussed in our Sukkot Drash, the 70 correspond to the 70 sons of Israel that went into Egypt. So 70, the nations, is a complete listing of the nations. It identifies the totality of humanity as divided up after the flood. Now, this provides us an interesting perspective. There's a kind of pulsing of numbers here. So if you look at this list, we start with one nation under Adam. Everybody is contained in that one man. And yet, as the sons and daughters are born, there become many people in the pre-flood, the antediluvian world. From one nation, Adam, to many peoples. And then at the flood, we go right back, one nation, Noach and his sons. And then it starts to spread out again. And we have the list of 70 nations, the total of humanity. Now, there are many nations. From that 70, it's proliferated. There's like 192 in the United Nations that are identified. And it kind of depends on how you identify a nation. Is it a people group? Is it a culture? Doesn't matter. There are many of them now. And even during the millennium, there are many nations. But, as we talked about during the Sukkot drashes, it's going to collapse back down. And during the Olam Haba, the world to come, we'll be back to one nation. So we come back and ask, is this genealogical list, which is interesting, the list of nations, is this just curious? Or does this have something to say for our life? Are there lessons for our life and how we live that we can get and derive from this list of nations, what we know about nations? So first, we can observe from the single points of conversion, those being all people descended from Adam and all people then descended from Noach, that they indicate to us that in fact we are all related to one another. We all have one father, first Adam and then Noach. Everyone is descended from Adam and Noach. In fact, if we are not directly descended, or in nuclear families, directly descended from one another, like your kids or your parents, or if we're not in a nuclear family, those of us who are married together in husband, wife, and children, then we are all cousins, let me put that in quotes, cousins at some degree of separation. We're all that closely related. We're all cousins. And we all have an equal standing before God. No one is closer, but has a closer biological connection than anyone else. We have an equal standing before God. And everyone is blessed by Adonai to be fruitful and multiply. There is such a commonality, such an equality. All people come from the same genetic stock. We don't have different kinds of humans. There are not better humans or worse humans. There's just humans. And you are not allowed, because of this commonality, this equality, you're not allowed to think of anyone as less or more than yourself. We are all equal. We're to prefer one another, yes, but you are not allowed to think of anyone as less than yourself. That is so common in the evil of this world, to denigrate others and say they're less than you are. But it's not true. This list teaches us that there's equality in all of humanity. Second, and borrowing from the discussion last week about the importance of names, the naming of the nations means that they are known by God. In fact, they are chosen by God. They're not accidental. It didn't surprise him what nations came. And since the nations are not accidental, we can go by extension, the citizens in those nations are not accidental. So the place that any citizen has, whatever nation he's born into, whatever time, has been selected by God. And by extension for us then, your ancestry, your nationality, your cultural customs are a gift from God, chosen by God for you. Now, I want to explain this idea of a gift again. Now, and it's going to pick up on some things that we've talked about in the past, but it's important. So I want to explain this idea of the gift of God again. Remember, we have talked in the past about the various gifts that God has given. Things like talents, skills, abilities. Those strengths that we have and can do well. Those we would call good gifts. I mean, we would think they're good. But God also gives weaknesses and frailties. Those areas in our life where we are prone to sin and fail. We have both. Those things we would call good and those things which we might not quite see as so good. We have said that God has given both of these to us, the talents, skills, and abilities, so that we can succeed and be a blessing. But the weaknesses and frailties are also given so that in resisting them, in our struggle against them, we can show our full devotion to Adonai, and at the same time develop a compassion for others in their weaknesses. So we've been given both what we would consider positive gifts and perhaps negative ones, but the negative ones are just as important, because it's in how we deal with them that we show our love for God. In a similar way, the culture that we are born into is a gift from God. Where that culture and its customs aligns with God's word, then we are blessed to understand and walk well before God. If that culture teaches us thanksgiving, it talks about righteous living, about humility, all of the qualities that God desires in his people. If it teaches us that, great. But where that culture and its customs perhaps deviate from what is godly, being hateful or being self-centered, in any way that it might deviate from godly conduct, then we can show our love and devotion to Adonai by rejecting that culture and its customs, at least those parts of them that are wrong, and instead pursuing God and his ways. One of the chief things that Paul said to the Greeks who came to faith was that they had to turn from those things that were ungodly and turn to godliness. They had to reject that culture. The same is true for us. If we are born in a culture that has some problems, we need to turn away from that. So remember, according to Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes 3:11, it says, He has made everything appropriate in His time. He has also set eternity in their heart, in the hearts of men, so that man will not find out the work which God has done from beginning even to the end. Let me paraphrase that. God has put eternity in the heart of man that they should seek for Him. So it doesn't matter what culture you're born into, because God has also put in your heart to seek Him. And He has also said through Paul in Romans chapter 1, there's an extended passage, verses 18 to 32, where Paul records that there's a universal awareness of God. Again, no matter what culture you're born into, yet there is an awareness of God. Let me read verses 19 and 20. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them, regardless of what culture you're born into. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made, so that they are without excuse. So if the culture and customs that we are born into are godly, great, we've got examples we can follow. If, however, that culture and customs that we're born into, if they deviate, and we know that God has put eternity in the hearts of man, that we should seek Him, and that the truth about God is not dependent on the culture. If the culture deviates from what God has shown to us to be true, then like the gifted weaknesses that we have, we need to reject that culture and pursue God. So that's the second thing we learn about the nations, is they've been appointed. The culture that we've been given is a gift from God. Not that we would necessarily follow it, but that we would either be blessed by it or be blessed in turning away from it because of who God is and our response to God. So the third thing about the nations. And what I'd like to do is that we take this list of nations and we consider that is a picture of the totality of humanity. And I want to consider it alongside Balaam's prophecy. This is from Numbers 23:9. Remember, Balaam was summoned by Balak, and they set out these different sacrifices. In 23:9, in one of Balaam's prophecies, he says, As I see him from the top of the rocks, and I look at him from the hills, Balaam speaking about Israel, behold, a people who dwells apart, and will not be reckoned among the nations. So now we have a separation, this idea of being holy and separate. There are the multitude of nations, the 70 nations, that covers the totality of humanity, and yet there is a separate, a small little nation that is set apart. So while there are nations that populate the earth, yet there is this one nation that is set apart. It is holy. That one nation that is a beacon to all others. That nation, in covenant with Adonai, is commissioned to be both a living witness and a testimony of God to all other nations, and to call to and to invite all nations to participate in seeking God according to the revelation that He has given to Israel. As we noted earlier, while there are many nations now, and even in the millennium, since we are in the Olam Hazeh, or I'm sorry, not since, once we are going to be in the Olam Haba, in the world to come, and there will be only one nation, the nation in covenant with Adonai, why not avoid the rush and join up now to be part of that nation, to be a light to the world? So, is this genealogical list, this table of nations, a teaching that can instruct and guide our life? I'd say that there are important lessons that lay a foundation for our walk of faith. They may not exactly be a detailed doctrine in there, but there are understandings of the work that God is doing and how we relate to that work and how we can properly be involved in that work. Shabbat Shalom.